Some moments in life stay with us forever, even when we think we've forgotten them. For one man living alone in Wyoming's winter wilderness, an ordinary morning became the day that would change everything. He spotted an empty wheelchair sitting by a frozen lake, and what he found beneath the ice took his breath away. A young woman, her body numb from the cold, looked up at him with eyes that somehow knew him. "I knew you'd save me," she said, but he couldn't remember ever meeting her before. She told him about a day years ago when he'd saved her life, a moment that meant nothing to him, but everything to her. What brought her back to this frozen lake, and who would leave a paralyzed woman to die alone? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Caleb Morrison had been awake since before dawn, as he was most mornings. At 58 years old, his body no longer required much sleep, and the silence of the mountains called to him in ways that the noise of dreams could not match. He dressed in layers, thermal underwear, flannel shirt, wool sweater, and his heavy canvas coat, moving through the ritual with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this thousands of times before. The cabin was small but well built, constructed with his own hands over the course of 2 hard summers 12 years ago. Pine logs, chinked tight against the Wyoming winters, a stone fireplace that could heat the single room to almost uncomfortable warmth, and windows positioned to catch the morning sun as it crested the eastern ridge. It was everything he needed and nothing he didn't, a place designed for solitude and survival, not comfort or company. He stoked the fire, added 2 logs from the stack beside the hearth, and set the kettle on to boil. While he waited, he stood at the window and looked out over the valley below. Snow covered everything in a blanket of white that seemed to glow even in the pre-dawn darkness. The thermometer outside read 12 degrees, not unusual for January in these mountains, though the wind had finally died down after 3 days of relentless howling. Caleb poured his coffee black, strong enough to strip paint, and took his first sip while studying the hand-carved walking stick that leaned against the doorframe. He'd made it during his first winter here, when the loneliness had been so crushing he'd needed something to do with his hands or go mad. The wood was smooth now, worn by years of use, the grip shaped perfectly to his palm. It had accompanied him on every walk, every trek through the wilderness, a constant companion that asked nothing and offered only support. He thought about the life he'd left behind, though he tried not to do that too often anymore. Caleb had spent 30 years with Colorado Search and Rescue, the last 15 as a senior field coordinator. He'd pulled hikers from crevasses, located lost children in forests, rappelled down cliff faces to reach stranded climbers, and coordinated rescue operations that saved dozens of lives. People had called him a hero. They'd given him medals and commendations and written articles about his dedication. None of it had mattered the night Anna and Lily died. The accident played in his mind sometimes, usually in the space between sleep and waking when his defenses were down. The mountain roads slick with rain, the deer that bounded into their headlights, his instinctive swerve, the guardrail that should have held but didn't, the tumbling, the impact, the terrible silence that followed. He'd crawled from the wreckage with nothing but bruises, while his wife and 8-year-old daughter were gone before the ambulance arrived. The investigators said he'd done everything right, that no one could have avoided it, that sometimes tragedy was just the cruelty of chance and timing. Their words meant nothing. He'd been the one driving, he'd been the one who was supposed to keep them safe, and he'd failed at the only rescue that truly mattered. So he'd walked away from it all, the job, the house full of memories, the well-meaning friends who didn't know what to say anymore. He'd driven north until the roads ran out, then hiked into these mountains until he found a place remote enough that the world couldn't follow. Here, he could be alone with his guilt and his grief, away from the expectation that he should heal, should move on, should somehow become whole again. The coffee finished. Caleb pulled on his boots, worn leather, resoled twice, and wrapped a scarf around his neck. He took the walking stick and stepped out into the morning cold. His breath came in white plumes as he locked the cabin door out of habit, though no one ever came this far into the wilderness, especially not in winter. His trapline ran a circuit of about 5 miles, checking snares and deadfalls he'd set for rabbits and the occasional fox. It wasn't sport, it was survival. The meat supplemented his stores, and the pelts could be traded at the supply station 30 miles south when he made his quarterly trips for flour, coffee, and ammunition. He'd learned to live on very little, and to need even less. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he made his way down the familiar path. Dawn was breaking now, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed almost obscene in their beauty. He remembered Anna loved sunrises, how she'd wake him early on weekends just to watch them together from their back deck. Lily would stumble out sleepy-eyed, wrapped in her favorite blanket, and climb into his lap while they all sat in comfortable silence. He pushed the memory away and focused on the present, the bite of cold air in his lungs, the weight of the walking stick, the tracks of a mule deer crossing his path sometime during the night. These were real, immediate things that demanded attention. The past was a ghost that could haunt him only if he let it. The first 3 traps were empty, which happened sometimes. The 4th held a snowshoe hare, already frozen, which he reset and moved on. He was nearly to the turnaround point of his route, where the trail descended toward the frozen lake at the valley's bottom, when something made him stop. It was a feeling more than anything concrete, an awareness that something was different, out of place. Caleb had learned to trust these instincts during his rescue years. The wilderness spoke to those who knew how to listen, and right now it was telling him that something was wrong. He scanned the tree line, looking for movement, for tracks, for anything unusual. At first he saw nothing. Then his gaze dropped to the lake below, and his heart went still in his chest. There, at the edge of the frozen water, sat a wheelchair. It was empty, dark metal stark against the white snow, positioned as if someone had simply stopped and decided to go no further. But there was no one near it, no tracks leading away that he could see from this distance, nothing but that solitary chair sitting abandoned in the cold. Caleb's mind raced through possibilities. Someone lost, confused, hypothermic. But how would they have gotten a wheelchair out here, miles from any road? An accident? A suicide? Every scenario seemed impossible. Yet there it was. He started down the slope, moving faster now, the walking stick biting into the snow for purchase. His breath came harder, not from exertion but from a rising dread that clutched at his chest. As he got closer, he could see more details. The wheelchair was modern, the kind designed for active users, with all-terrain wheels that might explain how someone could have maneuvered it this far. There was a coat draped over the back, dark blue, and a bag hung from one handle. Then he saw the hole in the ice. It was maybe 15 feet from the shore, a dark gap in the white surface where something had broken through. And in that gap, barely visible, was a hand reaching up toward the sky. Caleb ran. The ice cracked beneath his weight as Caleb threw himself flat, distributing his body across the surface. Years of training took over, muscle memory from dozens of winter rescues overriding the 12 years of rust. He crawled forward on his elbows, testing each movement, listening for the groan of ice, ready to give way. The hand was still there, fingers curled slightly, pale as death. He could see more now as he got closer, a woman's face beneath the water, eyes open, looking up at him through the crystalline surface. Her lips were blue, her dark hair floating around her face like seaweed, but her eyes were alive and aware, and locked onto his with an intensity that struck him like a physical blow. She was drowning, trapped, and those eyes were begging him not to look away. "Hold on," he said, though she couldn't possibly hear him through the ice and water. "I've got you." He used his walking stick to probe the ice around the hole, finding where it was still thick enough to support him. The break was roughly circular, maybe 3 feet across, the edges sharp where she'd fallen through. How long had she been in the water? Minutes? Longer? At these temperatures, hypothermia would set in within seconds, unconsciousness within minutes. Caleb positioned himself at the strongest point of the surrounding ice and reached down into the frigid water. The cold was a knife stabbing into his hand, his wrist, his forearm as he plunged deeper. His fingers found fabric a coat sleeve, and he grabbed hold, pulled. She didn't move. Something was holding her down. He repositioned, got both hands into the water now, ignoring the burning cold that made his joints scream. He followed the line of her body down and found the problem. Her legs were tangled in something beneath the surface, rope or cord wrapped around the wheelchair that had gone through the ice with her. She'd been strapped in, secured, left to sink when the ice gave way. Someone had done this deliberately. The realization brought a surge of rage that burned hotter than the cold, and Caleb used it. He pulled the hunting knife from his belt, plunged his whole arm into the water, and started sawing at whatever bound her. The rope, he could feel it now, thick and deliberately knotted, resisted at first, then began to fray. The woman's hand found his shoulder, gripped with surprising strength. Her eyes were still open, still watching him, but he could see consciousness starting to fade. Her body was shutting down, conserving what little warmth remained. "Stay with me," he commanded, his voice harsh in the winter silence. "Don't you dare give up." The rope parted. She came free suddenly, her body rising in the water, and Caleb grabbed her under the arms and hauled backward. The ice beneath him cracked a sound like a gunshot, and he scrambled away from the hole, dragging her with him, moving on pure instinct and adrenaline. They made it to solid ice, then to the snow-covered shore. Caleb pulled her away from the water's edge, his lungs burning, his wet arms already beginning to freeze in the open air. The woman wasn't moving, wasn't breathing, her body limp and cold as stone. He tilted her head back, checked her airway, began chest compressions, 30 hard pushes against her sternum, then 2 rescue breaths. Her lips were like ice against his. Again 30 compressions, fighting the clock, fighting death itself. "Come on," he growled. "Breathe." Water trickled from her mouth. He turned her head to the side, let it drain, then resumed compressions. His shoulders ached, his frozen hands barely functioning, but he didn't stop, couldn't stop, not when he'd gotten this far. On the 3rd cycle, she convulsed. Water spewed from her mouth as her body fought to expel it from her lungs. She gasped, choked, gasped again, the most beautiful sound Caleb had heard in years. Her eyes fluttered open, found his face. Her lips moved, forming words he had to lean close to hear. "I knew you'd save me," she whispered, her voice barely there. Caleb stared at her, not understanding. Her hand lifted, trembling, clumsy with cold, and touched his face with frozen fingers. "You don't remember, do you?" Her teeth were chattering so hard she could barely speak. The fire, 7 years ago. He didn't have time for this, whatever this was. Hypothermia was still killing her, just more slowly now. He stripped off his coat and wrapped her in it, then lifted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, her lower body completely limp, paralyzed, he realized, which explained the wheelchair. The cabin was a mile uphill, normally an easy walk, but carrying another person through snow while his own hands were approaching frostbite made it a brutal slog. He talked to her as he climbed, keeping her conscious, keeping her focused. "What's your name?" "Grace." The word was slurred. "Grace Whitmore." "Grace, I need you to stay awake. Can you do that for me?" "Cold." Her head lolled against his shoulder. "So cold." "I know. We're almost there." "Tell me about the fire." "You pulled her out." Grace's eyes were closing. "Emma. You saved Emma." The name meant nothing to him. Caleb had pulled dozens of people from burning buildings over his career. "Stay with me, Grace." "Who's Emma?" "My little girl." Her voice was fading. "You gave her back to me." They reached the cabin. Caleb kicked the door open and carried her straight to the fireplace. The fire had died down, but coals still glowed. He laid her on the floor in front of the hearth, added wood, blew on the coals until flames caught and grew. Then he began the delicate work of warming her without shocking her system. He'd done this before, knew the protocols, the dangers. Strip away the wet clothes she was barely conscious enough to help, her fingers useless. Wrap her in dry blankets from his bed. Position her near the fire but not too close. Check her core temperature, her pulse. Watch for irregular heartbeat that could signal cardiac arrest. He made hot water, added sugar and a pinch of salt, held the cup to her lips and made her drink in tiny sips. Her shivering was violent now, which was actually good. It meant her body was fighting back, generating heat. Caleb's own hands were white and numb. He warmed them carefully, watching for signs of frostbite, flexing his fingers until feeling returned in painful waves. Only then did he let himself look at what he'd found in her coat pocket when he'd stripped it away, a silver locket, frozen shut, small enough to fit in his palm. Grace was drifting in and out of consciousness, mumbling words he couldn't quite catch. He covered her with another blanket, checked her pulse again, thready but steady, and then carefully pried open the locket. Inside was a photograph, water-damaged but still visible. A little girl, maybe 4 or 5 years old, laughing at the camera, and beside her, holding her hand, was a younger version of the woman now lying unconscious in his cabin. On the other side of the locket was another photo, blurred and faded, but he could make out figures. A burning car, emergency vehicles, and a man carrying a small child away from the flames. The man was him. Caleb sat back, the locket heavy in his hand. 7 years ago, Colorado. There had been an accident on Highway 34, a multi-car pileup. He'd been first on scene, off-duty but unable to drive past. The SUV had been on fire, a woman trapped inside, screaming about her daughter. He'd found the child in the back seat, unconscious from smoke inhalation, pulled her out seconds before the fuel tank went up, handed her to the paramedics and then gone back for the mother, but the fire had been too intense. He'd tried God. He'd tried, but the flames had driven him back. He'd thought the woman had died. Grace stirred, her eyes opening halfway. She looked at him with recognition that he still didn't fully understand. "You left," she whispered, "before I could thank you, before I could tell you that you gave me a reason to live." Her hand found his, gripped weakly. "Emma survived because of you, and I survived because she needed me." Caleb's throat was tight. "I thought you died in that car." "I almost did." Grace's smile was sad, her lips still pale, "but they got me out, paralyzed from the waist down, but alive." Her eyes drifted to the locket in his hand. "I've been looking for you. For 2 years, I've been looking." "Why?" The question came out rough. "To say thank you." Her eyes were closing again, exhaustion pulling her under, "and because I needed to know if heroes were real." She slipped into sleep before he could respond, her breathing evening out, her body finally starting to warm. Caleb sat beside her, the locket still in his hand, and stared into the fire. He'd spent 12 years believing he couldn't save anyone, that his only talent was for failing the people who needed him most. But here was a woman who'd crossed 2 states to find him, who'd nearly died just to say thank you for a moment he'd barely remembered. The question that haunted him now wasn't why she'd come. It was who had tied her to that wheelchair and left her to drown in a frozen lake. The first 24 hours after discovering the tracks passed intense preparation. Caleb fortified the cabin with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent years anticipating disaster. He reinforced the door with timber braces, checked the integrity of every window, and positioned supplies where they could be reached quickly if needed. Grace watched him work, impressed by his efficiency and struck by how different he was from James. Where her husband had been all talk and bluster, making grand pronouncements about protecting his family while doing nothing of substance, Caleb simply acted. No wasted words, no dramatic gestures, just quiet competence that made her feel safer than she had in years. "Tell me about your daughter," he said on the second evening, as they sat by the fire eating a simple meal of venison stew. "The real story, not what you told other people." Grace set down her spoon, surprised by the question. Then she smiled, because talking about Emma was the easiest thing in the world. "She's 9 now, smart as a whip, brave as a lion, loves horses more than anything in the world." Grace's voice softened with affection. "Before the accident, I taught riding lessons at a stable outside Denver. Emma practically grew up in the barn. She was riding before she could walk properly." "Takes after her mother," Caleb observed. "Maybe. Though she got her stubbornness from her father, her real father, not James." Grace paused, old pain flickering across her face. "Emma's dad died when I was pregnant. Car accident. Drunk driver. I was 23, terrified, and suddenly alone." Caleb listened without interrupting, and Grace found herself telling him things she'd kept locked away for years, how she'd struggled as a single mother, working 2 jobs to keep them afloat. How Emma had been her light in the darkness, the reason she got up every morning. How meeting James had seemed like a miracle, a successful man who wanted to take care of both of them. "I thought I was so lucky," she said bitterly. "A ready-made family, financial security, someone to help shoulder the burden. I didn't see what he was really after, which was control." Grace stared into the fire. "James doesn't love people. He collects them. Having a wife and child made him look stable, family-oriented, trustworthy, good for business, good for his image. The actual people didn't matter, just what we represented." She fell silent, remembering the slow transformation of her marriage, how James's attentiveness had become surveillance, how his generosity had become strings attached to everything, how his love had become possession. "After the fire, after I was paralyzed, I became a liability instead of an asset," Grace continued. "A wheelchair-bound wife didn't fit the image he wanted to project. But divorcing me would look bad, make people ask questions, so he made my life miserable instead, hoping I'd be the one to leave. But you stayed." "For Emma," Grace's voice broke slightly, "I stayed because I was terrified he'd take her from me if I left. And I was right to be afraid the moment I filed for divorce. He started the custody battle. Claimed I was an unfit mother, that my disabilities made me dangerous to a child." Caleb's jaw tightened. "That's legal," Grace finished. "Disabled parents lose custody cases all the time. The courts say it's about the child's best interests, but really it's about bias and fear. James knew that. He exploited it." She wiped at her eyes, frustrated by the tears that insisted on falling. "I came looking for you because I needed to remember that good men exist, that someone, somewhere, had helped me without wanting anything in return. I needed," her voice dropped to a whisper, "I needed hope." Caleb reached over and squeezed her hand, a simple gesture that meant more than any eloquent speech. They sat in silence for a while, watching the fire burn down to coals. Then Caleb spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "I had a family once, a wife named Anna and a daughter named Lily." Grace went still, recognizing the past tense, the weight in his words. "Lily was 8 when she died. Car accident, 12 years ago." He stared at his hands, weathered and scarred from years in the wilderness. "I was driving. A deer jumped out. I swerved, and we went through a guardrail. I walked away with bruises." "They didn't walk away at all." "Caleb, I spent 30 years with search and rescue," he continued, as if he hadn't heard her. "Saved hundreds of lives, got medals and commendations, became something of a legend in my field. But I couldn't save the 2 people who mattered most." Grace understood then the isolation, the cabin in the middle of nowhere, the way he'd tried to fade from the world. He wasn't just hiding, he was punishing himself. "So I came here," Caleb said. "Figured if I couldn't save anyone, at least I couldn't fail anyone either. Seemed like the safest option for everyone involved." "But you saved me," Grace said softly. "Twice now. Maybe." He finally looked at her and she saw the doubt in his eyes. Or maybe I'm just delaying the inevitable. Maybe James will come back and finish what he started, and I'll have failed again. No, Grace's voice was firm. You don't get to do that. You don't get to save my life and then claim it doesn't count because you're afraid of failing. That's not how this works. Caleb blinked, surprised by her vehemence. I know about survivor's guilt, Grace pressed on. I know what it's like to be alive when someone else isn't, to wonder why you got to live when they didn't. I've spent 7 years asking myself why Emma survived that fire when I couldn't even protect her from being in the car in the first place. She leaned forward, catching his gaze and holding it. But here's what I've learned. We don't honor the dead by dying ourselves, either literally or figuratively. We honor them by living, by taking the second chances we've been given and doing something meaningful with them. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. Anna gave me this before we got married. He reached into his shirt and pulled out a silver compass on a worn leather cord. Said it was so I'd always find my way home. After she died, I kept it but stopped using it. Figured I didn't have a home to find anymore. He took the compass off and held it out to Grace. I want you to have it. Mum. Grace stared at the compass, understanding the significance of what he was offering. This wasn't just a keepsake. It was a promise, a commitment, a decision to stop running. I can't, she started. You can. Caleb pressed it into her hands. My wife never got lost with this compass. Neither will you. That's my promise to you, Grace. Whatever happens with James, whatever comes next, I won't let you get lost. Grace closed her fingers around the compass, feeling its weight, its warmth from Caleb's body. When she looked up at him, tears were streaming down her face, but she was smiling. Thank you, she whispered. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and silent. And somewhere in that darkness, danger was waiting. But inside the cabin, 2 broken people had found something neither expected a reason to keep fighting. Dawn came cold and clear on the 3rd day. Caleb had been awake for hours, watching the tree line from the cabin window, the rifle across his lap. The tracks he'd seen 2 days ago had multiplied more prints, coming closer, circling wider. Whoever was out there was getting bolder. Grace woke to find him at his post, his face drawn with exhaustion and determination. She pulled herself into her wheelchair with practiced movements, refusing to let him help despite his instinctive move toward her. I need to be able to do this myself, she said gently, seeing the confusion in his eyes. If things go wrong, if we have to move fast, you can't be worrying about whether I can function. Caleb nodded slowly, respecting her independence even as every instinct screamed to protect her. We need to talk about contingencies. They spent the morning planning. Caleb showed her his escape routes, the paths through the woods he knew by heart, the hiding places where someone could disappear if they knew where to look. Grace memorized everything, asking questions, pushing herself to understand the terrain, despite knowing she'd never be able to navigate it in her wheelchair. If James comes, if things go badly, Caleb said, his voice carefully neutral, I need you to promise me something. What? You survive. No matter what happens to me, you survive and you get back to Emma. He held up a hand when she started to protest. I know these mountains. I can disappear into them if I need to. But you need to promise me that saving you is worth something, that I'm not doing this for nothing. Grace wanted to argue, to tell him that his life mattered as much as hers, but she saw the plea in his eyes and understood. He needed to believe he could still save someone, that he could still make a difference. Denying him that would be cruel. I promise, she said, but you have to promise me something too. What's that? When this is over, when we're both safe, you come meet Emma. You let her thank you herself for saving her life. Grace's smile was watery. And maybe you stay for dinner. Maybe you remember what it's like to be part of something bigger than your guilt. Caleb looked away, but not before she saw the emotion in his eyes. Maybe, he said, which was more than she'd expected. They worked together through the afternoon. Caleb teaching her basic survival skills, while Grace shared what she knew about James, his patterns, his temper, his tendency to underestimate people he considered weak. She told Caleb about the men James knew, the kind of people who might help him for the right price. "He's not brave," Grace said. "He'll send others to do the dangerous work while he stays at a safe distance. But he'll want to be close enough to see it happen, to make sure I'm really gone." "Narcissist," Caleb observed. "Clinical," Grace confirmed. "I had him evaluated during the divorce proceedings. The psychologist said he exhibits all the classic signs: lack of empathy, need for control, belief in his own superiority. James doesn't see other people as real, just as tools to be used or obstacles to be removed." As the sun began to set, painting the snow in shades of gold and pink, Grace found herself studying Caleb. There was something about him that made her feel safe in a way she hadn't felt since before she'd met James, maybe even before the fire. It wasn't just his obvious competence or his determination to protect her. It was the quiet integrity she saw in everything he did. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. Caleb looked up from where he was checking the rifle's ammunition. "Go ahead. Why did you really leave search and rescue? I mean, I understand about Anna and Lily, but you could have kept saving people. Maybe it would have helped with the grief." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he set the rifle aside and came to sit across from her. "After the accident, I went back to work," he said. "Thought maybe you were right, that saving others would help. But every time I pulled someone from a wreck, every time I brought a lost child back to their parents, all I could think was, why them and not Lily? Why did these strangers get to live when my little girl died?" Grace's heart ached for him. "The final straw was a rescue about a month after the funeral," Caleb continued. "Family of 4 in a car that went off a mountain road. Same kind of accident that killed Anna and Lily. I got there first. And—" He paused, his voice rough. "I froze. For the first time in 30 years, I froze. Stood there while another rescuer pushed past me and pulled the family out. But they survived," Grace said softly. "They survived because someone else did my job, because I failed when they needed me most." Caleb's hands were clenched. "After that, I knew I couldn't trust myself anymore. So I left before I got someone killed." Grace reached out and took his hand, startling him. "You didn't fail them. You were grieving, traumatized, human, and you're here now, doing exactly what you were always meant to do, saving someone who needs help. That's different." "How?" "Because—" Caleb stopped, realizing he didn't have an answer. "It's not different," Grace said firmly. "You saved me from that lake because it's who you are. Not because you're trying to make up for Anna and Lily, not because you feel obligated, but because when you see someone who needs help, you help them. That's what heroes do. I'm not a hero." Emma would disagree. And so would I. Before Caleb could respond, a sound cut through the evening air, an engine in the distance, growing closer. They looked at each other, the moment of connection shattered by reality. Someone was coming. Caleb was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, moving to the window. Grace wheeled herself to where he'd shown her she'd be safest against the interior wall, away from windows and doors, where she could see both entries but had cover. The engine grew louder, then stopped. Silence fell, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Then a voice called out, smooth and familiar and hateful. "Grace, honey, I know you're in there. We need to talk." James had come. Caleb raised the rifle, sighting through the window at the figure standing 50 yards from the cabin. James Whitmore looked exactly like Grace had described, tall, well-dressed, even in winter gear, with the kind of polished confidence that came from money and privilege. He stood in the open, hands visible, playing at being reasonable. "Grace, please," James called out. "I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to talk. We can work this out." Grace's face had gone pale, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Don't believe him. Everything he says is a lie designed to manipulate." Caleb didn't take his eyes off James. I can see that. Question is, who else is out there with him? As if in answer, two more figures emerged from the tree line on either side of James. Men in their 30s, dressed for the mountains, carrying themselves like people who'd done hard things for money. The tracks made sense now, James and his hired muscle, watching and waiting for the right moment. There are witnesses who know where I am, James continued, his voice carrying across the snow. People who know I came here to bring my wife home, to protect her from herself. If anything happens to me, you'll be the first person they look for, Mr. Morrison. Grace gasped. He knows your name. Of course he does, Caleb said grimly. He's had days to research me. Probably knows my entire history by now. That's right, James said, confirming Caleb's guess. Former search and rescue coordinator, decorated hero, tragic figure who lost his family and ran away to play hermit in the mountains. Very dramatic. But here's what else I know: you're a good man, Morrison. You don't want innocent blood on your hands. Caleb's jaw tightened. So here's what's going to happen, James said, his tone shifting from conciliatory to commanding. You're going to send my wife out here. She's going to come home with me, where she belongs, and we're all going to forget this unfortunate incident ever happened. And if I don't, James smiled, and even from this distance Caleb could see the coldness in it. Then my friends and I will have to come get her. And accidents happen in the wilderness all the time, don't they? A reclusive mountain man, overcome with grief, attacks a man trying to help his disabled wife. Tragic that he had to be put down in self-defense. Grace's hand found Caleb's arm, gripping tight. He'll kill you, she whispered. He'll make it look justified and walk away clean. Caleb knew she was right. James had this planned out, every angle covered. But he'd made one critical mistake. He'd underestimated the man he was threatening. Grace, Caleb said quietly, not taking his eyes off the men outside. I need you to get your bag, the one with the letter to your sister. What? Do it. Now. Grace wheeled away, and Caleb heard her rifling through her belongings. James was getting impatient, moving closer, his hired men flanking wider. I'm waiting, Morrison, James called. Grace, Caleb said, still watching the approaching men. In your bag with the letter. Is there anything else? Anything about Emma? Grace went silent. When she spoke again, her voice was shaking. Because you're not here just to thank me. You're here because you're desperate, and desperate people make contingency plans. Caleb finally looked away from the window, meeting her eyes. What are you not telling me? Grace's face crumbled. The papers. In the sealed envelope, underneath the letter. I didn't want to burden you with it, didn't want you to feel obligated. What papers? Custody documents. The words came out in a rush. Emma isn't my niece, I told you that, but I didn't tell you everything, Emma. She stopped, took a breath. Emma is my biological daughter, but legally, James adopted her when we married. His name is on her birth certificate now, and 6 months ago, when I filed for divorce, he filed for sole custody. Caleb's blood ran cold. On what grounds? That I'm an unfit mother, that my disabilities make me a danger to her, that I've been unstable since the accident, depressed, possibly suicidal. Grace's voice was bitter. He's been building a case for years, documenting every bad day, every moment of frustration, every therapy session. He made it look like I was falling apart. And the courts believed him? The preliminary hearing is in 3 weeks. My lawyer says, Grace's voice broke, she says I'm going to lose. That unless something dramatic changes, James will get full custody, and I'll be lucky to get supervised visitation. The pieces clicked into place in Caleb's mind. That's why you came looking for me. Not just to say thank you. I needed proof that I'm not unstable, that I don't make reckless decisions. Grace pulled out the envelope with shaking hands. I documented everything finding you, the research I did, the careful planning. I thought If I could show the court that I successfully tracked down the man who saved Emma, that I was capable of complex problem-solving and long-term planning, maybe they'd see I'm not the broken woman James painted me as. Caleb took the envelope, opened it, and found exactly what she'd described. Not just a letter to her sister, but a meticulously documented account of her search for him, complete with maps, interview notes, and a detailed explanation of why finding him mattered. And underneath all that, a single photograph. Emma, recent, maybe from a few months ago, grinning at the camera with a gap-toothed smile. But it wasn't her face that caught Caleb's attention, it was what she was holding. A drawing of a man carrying a child away from flames. "She remembers you," Grace whispered. "She was only 4, but she remembers. She draws that picture all the time, tells people about the angel who saved her from the fire. It's her favorite story." Something shifted in Caleb's chest, a tectonic movement of emotion he'd been suppressing for 12 years. This child, this little girl he'd pulled from a burning car and then forgotten about, she'd remembered him, had made him part of her story, her understanding of the world. "I'm sorry," Grace was saying. "I should have told you sooner. But I was afraid you'd think I was using you, that I only cared about my custody case. But it's not like that, Caleb. Finding you, it mattered to me before I ever knew about James's custody filing. You mattered to me." "Time's up, Morrison." James's voice cut through the moment. He was closer now, maybe 30 yards. "Send her out or we're coming in." Caleb looked at the photograph again, at Emma's happy face, at the drawing she'd made of the man who'd saved her. Then he looked at Grace, this woman who'd nearly died twice in her quest to find hope in a world that had tried to crush her. He thought about Anna and Lily, about the family he'd lost, about the 12 years he'd spent hiding from life because he couldn't bear to fail again. And he made a decision. "Grace," he said calmly, "I need you to go into the bedroom. There's a loose board under the bed, second from the left. Pull it up. There's a satellite GPS beacon underneath, military grade, old but functional. Activate it, and then stay down." "What are you going to do?" Caleb checked the rifle, his movements practiced and sure. "I'm going to make sure Emma gets her mother back, and that James Whitmore learns what happens when you underestimate a mountain man." "Morrison!" James was shouting now. "Last chance." Caleb opened the cabin door and stepped out into the snow, the rifle held loosely but ready. Behind him he heard Grace activating the beacon. Help would come, eventually. He just had to keep them all alive until it arrived. James smiled when he saw Caleb, a predator's smile that didn't reach his eyes. "There's the hero. Ready to be reasonable?" "I've got a better idea," Caleb said. "You leave. Now. And maybe I don't put a bullet in you for attempting to murder your wife." James laughed. Bold words for a man outnumbered 3-1. "You're not hearing me." Caleb's voice dropped, became something cold and dangerous. "You're going to walk away, you're going to drop the custody case, and you're going to leave Grace and Emma alone. Because if you don't—" "What? You'll shoot me?" James gestured to his hired men. "You can't get all 3 of us, Morrison, and then you'll be dead, and Grace will be mine anyway." Caleb smiled, and it was a wolf's smile. "Want to bet your life on that?" For the first time, doubt flickered across James's face, because Caleb wasn't bluffing, and they both knew it. The standoff lasted maybe 5 seconds, though it felt like hours. James stood in the snow with his hired men flanking him, trying to read Caleb's face, trying to determine if this aging mountain man was really willing to die for a woman he barely knew. What James saw made him take a step back. "You're insane," James said, but his voice had lost its confidence. "She's not worth dying for. That's where you're wrong." Caleb's finger rested on the trigger, his aim steady despite the cold. "And you know what else? That beacon Grace just activated? Military grade, registered to the Colorado Search and Rescue Service. When it goes off, people come running, people I used to work with, people who know these mountains and know me." James's expression flickered the first real fear Caleb had seen. "You're bluffing." Am I? Caleb tilted his head. You researched me, right? Then you know I was with SAR for 30 years. You know I have friends in every emergency service from here to Denver. You think they won't respond when my beacon goes active? One of the hired men, the larger one, built like a linebacker, shifted nervously. Boss, if he's telling the truth about that beacon... He's bluffing, James snapped, but the confidence was cracking. Maybe, Caleb agreed, but are you willing to bet on it? Because here's what happens if I'm not. Helicopters arrive, federal rangers, probably local law enforcement. They find you here, threatening me and your ex-wife, who'll be very happy to tell them all about how you tried to drown her in a frozen lake. Her word against mine, James said, but he was already backing away. Plus the physical evidence, the ropes, the wheelchair with your DNA all over it, the journal documenting your abuse. Caleb advanced slowly, keeping the rifle trained on James's chest. Plus my testimony as a witness. Tell me, counselor, how do you think that plays in court? In front of a custody judge? James's face went white. He hadn't considered that angle. Too focused on eliminating Grace to think about what would happen if his plan failed. Narcissists never planned for failure. We're leaving, James said abruptly, gesturing to his men. This isn't worth it. Smart choice. Caleb didn't lower the rifle. But understand something. If you come near Grace or Emma again, if you make one more threat, send one more message, or try anything else, I will find you. And these mountains have a lot of places where bodies don't get found until spring. It was a bluff, mostly. Caleb wasn't a killer, had never been one despite his skills. But James didn't know that, and the cold certainty in Caleb's voice made it sound like truth. The three men retreated to their vehicle, a heavy-duty truck designed for mountain terrain. They climbed in, and Caleb watched until the engine started, and they began the long drive back down the mountain road. Only when they were out of sight did he lower the rifle, his hands shaking with adrenaline and relief. Grace appeared in the doorway, her face pale but determined. Did it work? The beacon? I don't know, Caleb admitted. It should have, if the battery's still good. But it's been years since I tested it. So we might not have help coming. We might not. Caleb came back inside, secured the door, and set the rifle aside. His whole body was trembling now, the aftermath of confrontation catching up to him. But James doesn't know that. He'll run because he thinks he's been caught. Grace wheeled closer, studying his face. You would have shot him. It wasn't a question, but Caleb answered anyway. If he'd forced my hand, yes. To protect you, to protect Emma, yes. Thank you. Grace's voice was soft. For everything. For believing me, for helping me, for... She stopped as Caleb suddenly held up a hand, listening. They both went silent, and then Grace heard it too, the distant whump, whump, whump of helicopter rotors. The beacon worked, Caleb said, surprise and relief flooding his voice. Help is coming. They waited in tense silence as the sound grew closer. Through the window, Caleb spotted the helicopter, a Forest Service bird, red and white, designed for mountain rescue. It circled once, twice, then found a clearing 100 yards from the cabin and began to descend. Stay here, Caleb told Grace. Let me talk to them first. Make sure. No, Grace's voice was firm. We do this together. Caleb looked at her, this woman who'd been through hell and come out fighting, and nodded. He helped her into her coat, then opened the door and pushed her wheelchair out into the snow. Together, they made their way toward the landing helicopter. 3 people emerged as the rotors slowed 2 flight medics and a pilot Caleb recognized immediately. Tom Brennan, his old partner from his SAR days, now graying but still sharp-eyed and competent. Caleb Morrison, Tom called out over the dying engine noise. Thought you were dead. You stubborn bastard. Takes more than 12 years of solitude to kill me, Caleb called back, and felt himself smiling, actually smiling for the first time in longer than he could remember. Tom approached, took in the scene. Caleb, Grace in her wheelchair, the fortified cabin behind them, and his expression shifted from relief to concern. Your beacon code came through, flagged as emergency distress. What's going on? So they told him everything. Grace's story poured out the fire 7 years ago, meeting James, the abuse, the divorce, the attempted murder. Caleb filled in the details of the rescue from the lake, the threats from James, the standoff that had just occurred. Tom listened, his face growing darker as the story unfolded. When they finished, he turned to his medics. Document everything. Photographs of the lake, the wheelchair, anything that can serve as evidence, and get a statement from both of them on record. Is it enough? Grace asked, her voice small. Enough to stop him? It's a start, Tom said. But Grace, you need to understand men like your husband have resources, lawyers, ways of making evidence disappear. This won't be easy. I know. Grace straightened in her chair, and Caleb saw the steel in her spine that had kept her alive through everything. But I'm done being afraid of him. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, I'm getting my daughter back. Tom nodded approvingly, then turned to Caleb. And you? What's your part in all this? Caleb looked at Grace, saw the hope and fear and determination in her eyes. Thought about Emma? About a little girl who'd remembered the man who saved her, who'd drawn pictures of him like he was something heroic. Thought about Anna and Lily, about how they'd want him to live, not just survive. I'm testifying, he said. I'm standing up in court and telling everyone what James Whitmore tried to do. And I'm making damn sure Grace keeps custody of her daughter. Tom's eyes widened slightly. You're sure? Once you do this, you can't fade back into the mountains. You'll be part of the world again. I know. Caleb reached down and took Grace's hand. Maybe it's time I stopped hiding. The medics worked efficiently, documenting everything, taking statements, providing medical care to Grace for the lingering effects of hypothermia. They wanted to evacuate her to a hospital, but she refused. Not until we secure the scene, she insisted. James could come back, destroy evidence. We need law enforcement here now. Tom made calls on the helicopter's radio. Within an hour, county sheriffs were on their way, along with a forensics team. James and his hired men had been stopped at a checkpoint 20 miles down the mountain, apparently. Caleb's threat about law enforcement had been more accurate than he'd realized. Someone at the ranger station had gotten suspicious about a vehicle leaving the area right after the emergency beacon activated. As the sun began to set, the small clearing near Caleb's cabin became a hub of activity. Police vehicles, more helicopters, investigators documenting everything. Grace gave her statement 3 times, each telling consistent and damning. Caleb corroborated every detail, his reputation and years of service lending weight to his words. James and his men were arrested, charged with attempted murder, conspiracy, assault. The evidence was overwhelming. Grace's journal, the wheelchair with rope marks, Caleb's testimony as a witness, even James's own GPS data showing he'd been at the lake when Grace went through the ice. Through it all, Grace sat in her wheelchair wrapped in emergency blankets, watching justice finally begin to unfold. Caleb stayed beside her, a steady presence as the chaos swirled around them. What happens now? She asked, as night fell and the investigators began to pack up. Now? Tom, who'd been coordinating with the various agencies, came over to answer. Now James sits in jail while the DA builds a case. Given the evidence, he's looking at 20 years minimum. And as for the custody case, I'll lose Emma, Grace said dully. He'll still find a way. No. Tom shook his head. Think about it, Grace. A man facing attempted murder charges? The family court judge will suspend his custody petition immediately. No court in the country awards custody to someone arrested for trying to kill the other parent. Grace's eyes widened. You mean... I mean Emma stays with you, probably permanently, once this all shakes out. Tom smiled. James Whitmore just lost everything, his freedom, his reputation, and his daughter. All because he underestimated a woman in a wheelchair and a mountain man who remembered what it meant to save someone. Grace burst into tears, and this time they were tears of relief, of joy, of release from years of fear and oppression. Caleb put his arm around her shoulders and let her cry, this woman who'd been so strong for so long. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder. "Thank you for giving me my life back." "You did that yourself," Caleb said. "I just cleared the path." As the last of the investigators departed, promising to return in the morning for follow-up, Caleb and Grace found themselves alone again in the cabin. The fire had burned down to coals, and Caleb rebuilt it while Grace watched, exhaustion finally catching up to her. "What now?" she asked. "For you, I mean. Will you stay here?" Caleb looked at the cabin, at the life he'd built on isolation and guilt. Then he looked at Grace, at the connection they'd forged through crisis and survival. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But for the first time in 12 years, I want to find out." Guilty on all counts. Caleb watched James's face as the verdict was read, saw the narcissist's mask finally crack. For a man who'd built his entire identity on control and superiority, being judged and found wanting by 12 ordinary people was the ultimate humiliation. The sentencing hearing came a week later. Grace gave a victim impact statement that left half the courtroom in tears, describing years of psychological abuse, the terror of being left to die in a frozen lake, the anguish of nearly losing her daughter to a man who saw her as property to be controlled. Emma didn't testify the prosecutor had spared her that trauma, but her presence in the courtroom spoke volumes. She sat beside her mother, one hand on Grace's wheelchair, the other clutching a stuffed horse that Caleb had given her. Her father never once looked at her, too focused on his own downfall to spare attention for the child he'd claimed to be fighting for. The judge sentenced James Whitmore to 23 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 17. The courtroom erupted in applause, which the judge allowed for a moment before calling for order. Outside, on the courthouse steps, Grace faced a wall of reporters. Caleb stayed close, protective, but she didn't need his protection anymore. She held her head high and spoke with quiet dignity about her ordeal and her determination to help other victims of domestic abuse. "No one should have to fight this hard just to be believed," she said. "No one should have to nearly die before the system takes their abuser seriously. If my story can help even one person find the courage to leave, to fight back, to survive, then everything I went through will have been worth it." Emma stood beside her mother's wheelchair, shy but proud, and when a reporter asked her how she felt, she said simply, "My mom is the bravest person I know." Caleb felt his throat tighten, remembering Lily, how she used to look at him like he hung the moon. The grief was still there, it would always be there, but it no longer consumed him. There was room now for other feelings, other connections, other kinds of love. As the press conference ended and they made their way to Grace's sister's car, Emma tugged on Caleb's sleeve. "Can you come to dinner tonight?" she asked. "Mom's making pot roast, and I made dessert all by myself." Caleb looked at Grace, who smiled and nodded. "We'd love to have you, if you're not in a hurry to get back to the mountains." He wasn't. The cabin was still there, still his refuge when he needed it. But Tom had convinced him to take on some consulting work with SAR, training new recruits, and that meant spending more time in Denver. It meant being part of the world again, and he was surprised to find he didn't hate it. "I'd be honored," he said, and Emma beamed. That evening, sitting around Grace's dining room table, she'd finally been able to afford her own place with the settlement money from James. Caleb felt something he hadn't experienced in 12 years. Peace. Not the numbing silence of isolation, but the warm, messy peace of being part of a family. Emma chatted about her day at school, about the horse she was learning to ride in Grace's new adaptive riding program. Grace talked about her plans to expand the program to help other disabled adults and children find freedom and confidence through riding. Melissa, Grace's sister, shared stories about her own kids, and the evening flowed with easy conversation and laughter. After dinner, while Grace and Melissa cleaned up, Caleb and Emma sat on the porch, She showed him more of her drawings, still lots of the fire rescue, but now there were new pictures. Grace, smiling, horses running, and one that made Caleb's breath catch, a drawing of 3 people. Grace in her wheelchair, Emma standing beside her, and a tall man with a walking stick, all holding hands. "That's our family," Emma said matter-of-factly. "Is that okay?" Caleb looked at this 9-year-old girl who'd survived fire and loss and her father's cruelty, who'd somehow kept her heart open and her spirit bright. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "That's more than okay." Emma hugged him, fierce and tight, and Caleb held her carefully, this precious child who wasn't his daughter but who'd somehow claimed a piece of his heart anyway. Grace found them like that when she wheeled out onto the porch. She didn't say anything, just smiled and reached out to take Caleb's free hand. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over Denver, and Caleb thought about how far they'd all come. From a frozen lake where death had waited to this warm porch where life bloomed. From isolation and fear to connection and hope. From 2 broken people surviving alone to something that looked remarkably like a family, learning to thrive together. Anna's compass hung around Grace's neck now. She wore it always, a reminder that she'd found her way home. And Caleb had carved a new walking stick, this one intended as a gift for Grace, for the trails they'd explore together once spring came. He'd spent 12 years believing his story was over, that the best parts of his life were behind him. But sitting here with Grace's hand in his and Emma's head on his shoulder, Caleb realized something profound. Sometimes the best chapters come after we think the book is closed. Sometimes salvation comes from the people we save, and healing comes from the courage to try again. Sometimes frozen lakes and mountain rescues are just the beginning. 3 months after the trial, spring arrived in the Wyoming mountains. The snow began to melt, revealing the green beneath, and the frozen lake where Grace had nearly died became a mirror, reflecting blue sky and new beginnings. Caleb stood on his cabin porch, watching an adapted SUV navigate the rough mountain road. He'd spent the past week making final preparations, widening the path, building a proper wheelchair-accessible ramp, adding a second room to the cabin that would serve as Emma's bedroom when they visited. Because they would visit regularly. Grace had made that clear, and Caleb had discovered he wanted nothing more. The SUV pulled up, and Emma burst from the passenger door before Grace could even put it in park. She ran to Caleb with the boundless energy of a 9-year-old who'd been cooped up in a car for 3 hours. "Caleb, we brought supplies, and Mom says I can learn to fish. And look," she thrust a drawing at him, another masterpiece of stick figures and bright colors. This one showed the cabin, surrounded by mountains, with 3 figures on the porch. "It's beautiful," Caleb said, and meant it. He'd started a collection of Emma's artwork, pinning them to the cabin walls until the rough wood was covered in color and life. Grace maneuvered the ramp with practiced ease, looking vibrant and healthy in a way she hadn't when he'd first pulled her from the lake. She wore hiking clothes adapted for wheelchair use, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, Anna's compass visible at her throat. "The road's gotten better," she observed, wheeling up to the porch. "Tom helped me grade it last month. Said if I'm going to have regular visitors, I should at least make it navigable." Caleb helped her up the ramp, though she barely needed the assistance anymore. "How was the drive?" "Long, but worth it." Grace looked out at the mountains, breathing deep. "I missed this, missed the peace of it." They settled into an easy rhythm over the next few days. Caleb taught Emma to fish in the stream that fed the lake, showed her how to identify animal tracks, explained the ecosystem of the mountains with the patience of someone who'd had decades to learn it. Grace worked on expanding her adaptive riding program from her laptop, occasionally looking up to watch Caleb and Emma together, and smiling at what she saw. In the evenings, they cooked together, Caleb handling the grilling, Grace managing the sides, Emma setting the table with exaggerated care. They ate on the porch as the sun set, and talked about everything and nothing, building the kind of comfortable familiarity that only comes with time and trust. On their third night, after Emma had fallen asleep in her new room, Grace and Caleb sat by the fire. The silence between them was companionable, the kind that didn't need filling. "I got the final divorce papers yesterday," Grace said eventually. "It's official now." Caleb nodded, not sure what to say. They'd been dancing around their growing feelings for months, both of them cautious, both scarred by their pasts. "James won't be eligible for parole for 17 years, Grace continued. "Emma will be 26 by then, an adult with her own life. He'll have missed everything. That was his choice." "I know." Grace turned to look at Caleb. "And I've made my choice too. I'm not going to waste any more of my life being afraid or looking backward. I want to move forward. With Emma, with my work." She paused, took a breath. "With you, if you're willing." Caleb felt his heart race. "Grace, I'm not asking for promises or labels," she said quickly. "I just want you to know that what we have, this friendship, this connection, it means everything to me. You gave me my life back, Caleb, not just at the lake, but every day since. You showed me what it looks like when someone cares without trying to control, supports without smothering, loves without—" She stopped, realizing what she'd said. Caleb saw the panic in her eyes, the fear that she'd revealed too much, too soon. He reached over and took her hand, the same hand he'd pulled from the frozen water, now warm and strong in his. "Anna used to tell me that love isn't something you find once and lose forever. She said love is like the seasons. It changes, it cycles, it comes back in different forms." Grace's eyes glistened with tears. "I loved my wife and daughter," Caleb continued. "I'll always love them, but loving them doesn't mean I can't." He struggled with the words, then gave up on finding perfect ones. "I care about you, Grace, about Emma, about the life we're building together, whatever that looks like." "Is that enough?" Grace whispered. "I know I come with complications, a disability, a daughter, trauma, legal battles that might never fully end." "You come with strength," Caleb interrupted, "with courage, with hope, with the kind of resilience that makes me want to be better. You came looking for a hero, but what you showed me is that I stopped being one when I stopped letting people in." He pulled out something from his pocket, a small box carved from mountain pine. Inside was a compass, new and shining, a match to the one Grace wore. "I made this for Emma," he said. "Thought she should have one too, so she'll always find her way home, wherever home is." Grace took the compass with shaking hands, holding it like the treasure it was. "She'll love it. There's something else." Caleb reached into his other pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. From it he drew a simple silver ring. No diamond, just a band etched with a mountain pattern. "This isn't an engagement ring. I don't even know what to call it. A promise. Maybe. That I'm here. That I'm not going anywhere. That whatever comes next, we face it together." Grace stared at the ring, tears streaming down her face. "Caleb Morrison, are you asking me to be your what, exactly?" He laughed, the sound rusty but genuine. "I guess I'm asking if you'll be my partner, in whatever way that means. No rush, no pressure, just together." "Yes." Grace slipped the ring on her finger where it fit perfectly. "Yes to all of it." They sat holding hands as the fire burned low, two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely way, who'd saved each other when saving seemed impossible. Outside, the mountains stood eternal and indifferent, but inside the cabin, something precious was growing, a new kind of family, built not on biology or obligation, but on choice and commitment and the courage to love again after loss. Emma's drawing hung on the wall, 3 stick figures holding hands, and for the first time in 12 years, Caleb looked at it and thought, "Yes, that's us, that's home." The walking stick he'd carved for Grace leaned against the doorframe, ready for the trails they'd explore together when summer fully arrived. Anna's compass and Emma's new one would guide them, but they wouldn't need much guidance. They'd already found what they were looking for, each other.